Forget the glamorous gladiator films, the grand speeches of senators, or the romances in lavish villas. To truly understand the Roman Empire, we must begin at its darkest, where its foundations were built not in marble, but in the silence and tears of millions of slaves. The story of Roman love and sex is not a love song, but a brutal indictment of property. It is written in the whip marks on a slave's back, in the horror in the eyes of a conquered woman, and in the cold calculations of a breeding program designed to create more wealth. Before we explore the scandals of the emperor or the debauched festivals, we must descend into the abyss where most Romans lived and loved. A world where consent was an alien concept, and survival was the only joy. In the mind of a Roman citizen, the world was divided into people and things. And slaves, despite their human form, fell into the latter category. They were designated by a cold word, res, which means thing. Like a table, a chair, or a horse, they were the absolute property of their master. This meant not only that they were forced to work themselves to the point of exhaustion, but also that their bodies, every inch of their flesh, were at the master's disposal. The concept of physical assault or rape of a slave simply did not exist in Roman law, because one could not violate something that one owned. In every splendid villa in Rome or Pompeii, behind its ornate walls, there was an institutionalized system of sexual exploitation. The male slave master had full authority to satisfy his sexual desires with any slave, male or female, old or young. This was not a shameful, clandestine act, but a socially recognized privilege, an assertion of status and power. A Roman wife could grit her teeth and endure her husband openly having affairs with beautiful young female slaves in the comfort of her own home. Objection? It was almost unthinkable, because in Roman society, the husband's behavior was not considered adultery. He was simply using his property. But the cruelty did not stop there. Slave masters went further, turning their slaves into controlled reproductive devices. Systematic breeding programs were established. Healthy male and female slaves were forced to mate, not out of love or choice, but simply to produce new slave children, a self-replicating source of wealth. The resulting children, regardless of their parentage, became the slave master's property. The sacred maternal bond was torn apart from the moment the child was born. The slave mother could be sold at any time, separated from a child she could never truly own. This was the true face of the Roman family at its lowest level, a human breeding farm where love and blood ties were crushed under the boot of economic gain. And as the mighty Roman legions advanced beyond their borders, this brutality multiplied on an even more horrific scale. Sexual violence was not just a byproduct of war, it was a tool of war. The women of conquered lands were taken as spoils of war, as prizes for the victorious soldiers. Mass rape was not a war crime, but a recognized right of conquest. It was a way to terrorize the enemy, to humiliate men who had failed to protect their women, and to wipe out a lineage by infusing it with the blood of the invader. Roman colonial policies frequently involved the sexual control and exploitation of indigenous peoples, turning their bodies into another battlefield, a symbol of Rome's absolute dominance. From the dark corridors of a Roman home to the cities ravaged by the iron heel of the legions, a horrifying truth emerges. This great empire was built on the denial of the humanity of millions, and their intimate lives were just another chapter in the long story of oppression. If the world of the slave was a living hell defined by absolute obedience, then the world of the Roman citizen was, at first glance, the pinnacle of freedom. He was the center of the universe, the master not only of his family and property, but also of his own destiny. From what we have seen in the previous section, it seems that the Roman man could do whatever he wanted with anyone below him on the social ladder. He could use his slaves as objects and treat his conquered women as trophies. His sexual power seemed limitless. But this is precisely the paradox, one of the biggest misunderstandings when we look at Roman society. The truth is, the sexual life of a Roman citizen was not a playground of freedom, but a narrow stage, full of hidden rules and deadly traps. His freedom is essentially a gilded cage of social expectations and pressures. To understand this cage, we must completely abandon the modern notion of homosexuality or heterosexuality. For the Romans, what mattered was not the gender of their sexual partner, but the role they played in the sexual act. This was the unchangeable rule, the red line that determined a man's honor and status. A true Roman citizen, a vir, meaning real man, must and could only be the active partner, the penetrator. Whether his sexual partner was his wife, a female slave, a male slave, or a young male prostitute, as long as he maintained the dominant role, the act was completely socially acceptable. In contrast, to play the passive, penetrated role was an unimaginable humiliation for a citizen. It meant lowering oneself to the level of women, slaves, or barbarians, people who were considered weak and born to be submissive. This humiliation was not only a personal stain, it could ruin one's political career and social standing. A classic example was the ridicule that Julius Caesar faced throughout his life. His enemies repeatedly spread rumors that in his youth, Caesar had played the passive role in a relationship with King Nicomedes of Bithynia. Although there was no solid evidence, this accusation followed Caesar like a ghost, chanted by his political opponents in the Senate. They called him Queen of Bithynia, an insult that was the ultimate insult to the masculinity and power of one of the greatest men in history. This shows that in the Roman world, power was not only demonstrated on the battlefield or the execution ground, but was also asserted in the bedroom. This rule of active/passive roles also governed another controversial aspect of Roman society: homosexual relationships between adult men and young boys, pederasty. These relationships were accepted within a certain framework, precisely because they adhered to the hierarchy of power. The adult man, a full citizen, played the active role, the guide and educator. The young boy, not yet a full citizen with full rights, was in the passive role, the recipient. The relationship was justified as a form of mentoring, helping the young boy learn to become a real man. However, this is a relationship with a time limit. When a young man begins to grow a beard, a sign of maturity and becoming a citizen, the relationship must end. If the older man continues to pursue, he will be seen as a sick predator, trying to violate a citizen of his own right. And if the young man continues to play a passive role, he will be despised by society, seen as having lost his manhood and will never be able to become a true vir. Once again, we see that it is not love or education, but the maintenance of power structures and social status that is the decisive factor. Thus, the picture of the free and uninhibited Roman man began to crack. His sex life was a series of tense performances. Each intimate act was not only a personal satisfaction, but also a declaration of his position in Rome's brutal hierarchy. He had to constantly prove his masculinity, his dominance, not only to those below him, but also to the watchful eyes of his equals. His bedroom, like the Roman Forum, was a political arena where a mistake could lead to destruction. His freedom was built on the oppression of others, and at the same time, he was bound by those same oppressive rules. If the life of a Roman man was a constant show of power, his main stage was his family, and the most important figure, the measure of his honor and success, was none other than his wife, a Roman matrona. In our imagination, this woman is often associated with modesty, nobility, and respectability. She was the manager of a vast estate, the mother of future citizens, the embodiment of the supreme virtue called pudicitia, modesty, purity, and virtue. She was placed on a pedestal of respectability, a living symbol of the stability and order of Roman society. But if we strip away the gilded veneer of the ideal, a naked and paradoxical truth emerges. The gilded cage in which the Roman woman lived was both a place of protection and an elaborate prison, and her virtue, ironically, did not really belong to her. Pudicitia is not a concept of personal morality or a woman's self-control. It is a measure of her absolute loyalty to her husband. A wife's virtue is her husband's most valuable asset, a testament to his power and control. Imagine her as a treasure chest that is locked, shiny, and unscratched. The value of the chest lies not in what is inside, but in its integrity, its inviolability to others. It proves that there is only one owner of the key. A wife who keeps Pudicia is a wife who brings glory to her husband. On the contrary, a wife who fails to keep Pudicia will not only ruin her own reputation, but also be a public humiliation to her husband, showing him to be incompetent and incapable of controlling his family. Because women were such an important asset to the Roman elite, marriage among the elite was rarely a love affair. It was a business negotiation, a cold political transaction. A father, the patriarch of a family with absolute power, the paterfamilias, would use his daughter as a pawn on the chessboard of power. A successful marriage could merge two vast fortunes, create a strong political alliance, or simply befriend a rising family. Girls were often betrothed at a very young age, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, to men much older than them. Their wishes, feelings, and dreams were completely ignored. The wedding night, often the first time a couple is alone together, is not a romantic moment of soul union. It is a time of pressure to fulfill a contract. Consummation of the bed must occur to make the marriage official, and, most importantly, to begin the wife's ultimate duty, to produce a legitimate heir, a son to carry on the family name and inherit the property. Marriage contracts are not vows of love, but detailed legal documents that spell out dowries, property rights, and harsh penalties for adultery, a crime that almost exclusively applies to women. Even the rituals of the wedding emphasize this transfer of ownership. The groom's carrying of the bride across the threshold of his home is not only a beautiful gesture, but also a symbolic gesture that the girl has officially passed from her father's control to her husband's. And this gilded cage, though seemingly strong, was incredibly fragile. Divorce in Rome was surprisingly easy, especially for the husband. He simply announced in front of a few witnesses that the marriage was over. For the man, divorce had little social consequence. He could quickly remarry, finding a younger wife, a larger dowry. But for the woman, it was a disaster. While she might get her dowry back, she would lose everything: her home, her social status, and, most painfully, her children. Under Roman law, children always belonged to their father's family. A divorced mother would be forced to leave alone, her reputation ruined, and her chances of remarrying someone of equal status virtually nil. This was the tragic paradox of the Roman woman. She was held up as a symbol of honor, yet a political pawn. She was the steward of a vast fortune, yet she was the asset herself. She was protected in a gilded cage, yet powerless when the cage door slammed shut behind her. A few extraordinary women, like Livia, wife of Emperor Augustus, learned to manipulate the system from within, using information and influence to create their own power. But for thousands of others, life was a constant trade-off between security and freedom, an existence in which their greatest value lay outside their own hands. When the Roman matron of honor, the matrona of whom we have spoken, moved about the city, she usually sat in a closed litter, carried by slaves. Through the cracks in the curtains, she glimpsed a completely different world, a world of noise, chaos, and sensuality from which she was absolutely forbidden. This was the world of the Roman street. If sexual life within the family was governed by rigid rules of honor, outside those walls a completely different reality was revealed. Sex was not hidden. It was an open secret, a legalized trade, an indispensable part of the daily pulse of the city. Leaving the gilded cage of the family, we entered a vast marketplace of desire. The heart of this social life was the public bathhouse, or thermae. These were more than just places to bathe. They were huge complexes with libraries, gymnasiums, gardens, and food stalls. Most importantly, there were places where people from all walks of life, from craftsmen to merchants to politicians, came together and socialized. This mixing broke down rigid social boundaries and created a unique environment where rules of conduct were looser. As a result, the bathhouses quickly became hot spots for sexual encounters. The line between a casual flirtation and an offer of sex was sometimes as thin as the steam that filled the air. In the dark corners, whispers could quickly turn into bargaining, and a relaxing afternoon could end in a physical exchange. From the obscurity of the baths, we enter the surprisingly organized and regulated industry of prostitution. Contrary to popular belief, prostitution in Rome was not an outcast. It was a legal and regulated profession. Prostitutes, known as meretresses, had to register officially with local officials. They even had to wear special clothing, usually a toga, the dress of a male citizen, to distinguish themselves from the respectable women who wore the stola. The purpose of this was not so much to humiliate, but to categorize, to make the social order visible. By marking who was a public woman, Roman society could protect the illusory purity of the private women of the patrician households. The industry was deeply embedded in the very fabric of the city. The brothels, or lupanaria, that we see preserved almost intact in Pompeii reveal a stark reality. They were purpose-built buildings with small cell-like rooms, a stone bed, and vivid frescoes depicting sexual acts, perhaps as much for decoration as for serving as a menu for customers. But prostitution was not limited to brothels. It was everywhere. Taverns, inns, capponi, and even under the arcades of amphitheaters and theaters were places where prostitutes sought customers. The great Roman road network, the lifeblood of the empire, was also a route for the sex trade. Roadside inns often doubled as brothels, catering to travelers, merchants, and soldiers. The Roman city was, in a sense, a map of desire, where every street corner could harbor a physical trade. And who was the regulator, the one who profited most from this map? It was the Roman state. Rather than acting as a guardian of morality, the state acted as a pragmatic regulator. A system of taxes was imposed on prostitutes and brothels. By licensing and taxing, the state both legalized the industry and turned it into a significant source of revenue for the state. The main concern of the law was not morality, but order and profit. They regulated the industry to prevent public disorder, to ensure that tax revenue flowed into the state's coffers, and, most importantly, to maintain a clear distinction between a woman who was owned by a man and a woman who could be owned by anyone with money. Thus, a profound contrast emerged. While the honor of the elite was strictly guarded behind closed doors, the streets were shaken by a raw, commercialized, state-sanctioned sexuality. This open secret, known to everyone but rarely spoken of, exposed the hypocrisy inherent in Roman society. It was not a society that shied away from sex, but one obsessed with classifying, controlling, and profiting from it. From the noisy streets and bathhouses, where sex was openly traded, let's take a step back into a more private, but no less brutal space, the human body. If Roman society was obsessed with classifying and controlling people, that obsession was also violently expressed in their bodies. The pursuit of an ideal of beauty and the attempt to control fertility was not a journey of free expression. On the contrary, it was a painful, dangerous, and sometimes deadly struggle. The bodies of Romans, especially women, became a battlefield where harsh cultural ideals were written with razors, toxic chemicals, and life or death choices. For the Roman elite, a hairless body was a sign of civilization, a way to distinguish themselves from the hairy barbarians beyond their borders. This obsession led to a never-ending war on every hair on the body. Hair removal methods were brutal. Imagine using heated copper tweezers, valzella, to pluck hairs one by one, or using pumice stones to rub the skin until both the hair and the skin were worn away. Even more painful were homemade waxes, highly corrosive chemical mixtures that could burn and leave permanent scars. This was no ordinary beauty treatment. This was a painful ritual of status, of voluntary torture to conform to a harsh beauty standard. For women, the battle was even more brutal. The Matrona's ideal of beauty was pale, porcelain skin. A pale complexion meant she had not toiled in the sun, an unmistakable sign of wealth and status. To achieve this aristocratic complexion, they turned to one of the most toxic substances of antiquity, white lead. They crushed the lead, mixed it with wax or animal fat to create a foundation called cerussa. This powder perfectly concealed blemishes, creating a white, flawless mask. But the price was a slow death. The lead would seep through the skin, enter the bloodstream, and destroy the body from within. Victims suffered hair loss, gum damage, nervous breakdown, infertility, and ultimately an agonizing death. They were killing themselves every day just to look the part. The Roman ideal of beauty was, quite literally, a deadly beauty. Alongside the battle over appearances was a much quieter and more desperate battle: the battle over fertility. In a society where an illegitimate child could completely ruin an upper-class woman's reputation, where a pregnancy could end a prostitute's career or bring death to an adulterous wife, contraception and abortion became an urgent necessity. The Romans experimented with a myriad of methods. Some were harmless, but also useless, such as wearing charms or performing elaborate rituals. Others, such as coitus interruptus, relied entirely on the man. In desperation, many women resorted to extremely dangerous methods. They drank highly toxic herbs. One of the most famous was silphium, a rare plant native to North Africa that was believed to be an effective contraceptive. It became so expensive and sought after that it was harvested to near extinction by the 1st century AD. Other plants, such as pennyroyal, were also widely used, despite the fact that high doses could cause liver failure and death. When contraception failed, the last resort was abortion, an even more gruesome procedure. The doctors of the time, with limited knowledge of anatomy and no concept of hygiene, performed the abortions with sharp metal instruments. The rates of infection, hemorrhage, and death were extremely high. For a Roman woman, the decision to have an abortion was a life-or-death gamble, a choice between facing social annihilation and the risk of losing her life on the operating table. Underpinning all these dangerous practices was a primitive medical system, a curious mix of empirical observation and deep-seated cultural prejudices. Roman medical texts depicted the female body as a flawed, weak, unstable, and inferior version of the male body. This science was used to justify social order and reinforce risky medical practices. Education also reinforced this cycle. Boys were taught to be masters, while girls were taught to be submissive, with sex education focused on roles as wives and mothers. Thus, from birth, a woman's body was shaped not by her own desires, but by the demands and expectations of society. Their pursuit of beauty and control is not an expression of vanity, but a tragic testament to the pressures of survival in a world where outer appearance determines inner destiny. Having dissected the individual's brutal war with his or her own body, let us turn our gaze to another dimension, one that determined the fate of the Romans more than law or military force: the spirit world. When we think of religion, we often imagine solemn rituals, silent prayers, and strict moral codes. But the Roman spirit world was a different story. It was not an ethereal place set apart from the mundane. On the contrary, it was a mirror that reflected, and sometimes amplified, the most primal and earthly aspects of human existence, especially sexuality. For the Romans, the gods were not distant moralists. They were pragmatic, lustful forces, and to communicate with them, one had to use a language that both gods and humans understood: the language of life, creativity, and desire. This blending of the sacred and the profane was most evident in religious festivals. Take the Floralia, a multi-day festival honoring Flora, the goddess of flowers and fertility. During the festival, conventional social norms were upended. Respectable women, who had traditionally worn dark clothing, could don bright colors. Theaters, instead of presenting high-minded tragedies, entertained crowds with mimes, in which actors would strip naked and openly perform sexual acts. At its climax, prostitutes, who were relegated to the bottom of society, became a central part of the ritual. They would strip, dance, and engage in naked wrestling as the crowd watched and cheered. To modern eyes, this may seem like a scene of decadence, but to the Romans, it was a vital religious act. They believed that by displaying their ecstasy, their nakedness, and their sexual energy, they were pleasing the goddess Flora. The joy of the people would encourage her to bless the harvest, to make the trees blossom and the animals multiply. This was not a perversion. It was a sacred civic duty, a calculated bargain with the gods. The paradox was that the very society that had laid down the most stringent rules for women had set aside special days to break all of them in the name of the gods. Beyond public festivals, the link between sex and religion extended into more mysterious and extreme spaces. The concept of sacred prostitution is one example. While its prevalence in Rome itself is still a matter of debate, its presence in Eastern cults adopted by the Romans, such as the cults of Isis and Cybele, suggests a direct link between religious service and sexual behavior. It was believed that having sex with a priest or priestess in a temple was a way of communicating with the gods, an act of physical sacrifice in exchange for a blessing. Worship was sometimes pushed to extremes. The cult of Cybele included priests called Galli. In a state of frenzied ecstasy during the ritual, these men would castrate themselves with sharp stones, discarding their genitals as an offering to the goddess. This act of extreme sexual sacrifice was seen as a way to surrender oneself completely, to shed one's masculinity and become a pure servant of a powerful goddess. For ordinary people, when the gods seemed too distant, they turned to a more practical tool: magic. Love, jealousy, and lust were the main problems targeted by Roman magic. Archaeologists have found thousands of depiction tablets. A person who had been rejected by love or wanted to get rid of a rival would write a curse on a thin sheet of lead. They called upon the gods of the underworld, using powerful names to bind their beloved, making them unable to eat, sleep, or live without them. These sheets of lead would then be nailed to a sacred place like a tomb or a well. People also concocted love potions with terrifying ingredients such as hair, fingernails, menstrual blood, and other bodily fluids, believing that they contained magical powers that could control the will of others. All of these beliefs stem from a fundamental principle of the ancient worldview: sympathetic magic. The Romans believed that everything in the universe was connected by invisible threads. As in heaven, so on earth. Actions on a small scale could influence outcomes on a large scale. A farmer might engage in sexual intercourse in his fields, not out of desire, but because he believed that human creativity would encourage Mother Earth to become fertile and productive. Human sexuality and the fertility of the earth were one. The Roman spiritual world, then, was not a place to escape from earthly desires. It was a place to confront them, to amplify them, and to try to control them. The gods were not moral judges. They were partners in a cosmic bargain where sex was both sacrifice and reward, a powerful and primal current at the very heart of life and death. From the world of magic and religious ritual, where the Romans tried to negotiate with the supernatural, let us turn to another area: how they dealt with themselves. How did a society with so many rules, pressures, and hypocrisies about sex actually talk about it? In art, contemplate it in literature, and grapple with it in philosophy. When we enter the cultural world of Rome, we discover a final and perhaps most surprising paradox: a society obsessed with controlling sexual behavior, yet surprisingly comfortable with turning it into a public spectacle, a subject for art and an intellectual debate. Look at Roman art, especially what survived in the dust of Pompeii and Herculaneum. The walls of homes, baths, and even brothels were decorated with images that would be considered pornographic to modern eyes. But for the Romans, they were part of the everyday visual landscape. We see frescoes depicting gods seducing or raping mortals, explicit sex scenes in various positions in brothels, and phallic symbols, fascinum, carved everywhere. These symbols were not just sexual. They were also considered lucky charms, a means to ward off evil spirits and bad luck. The prevalence of these images is not evidence of a decadent society, but of a worldview where sexuality was seen as a natural, powerful, and omnipresent force. It was a symbol of fertility, power, and life. Its display in art was not a shameful act to be hidden, but an acknowledgement of its primal power. Roman art did not shy away from the reality of physical desire. It confronted it, depicted it, and integrated it into everyday life, making the most private acts part of the public experience. If art is a mirror of outward behavior, then literature is a window into the complex inner world of the Romans. Here we find a picture quite different from the cold, transactional marriages we have discussed. In poetry, love is portrayed in all its passion, jealousy, anguish, and passion. The poet Catullus, in his immortal poems to a lover he called Lesbia, chronicles the entire course of an ill-fated love affair. He writes of passionate kisses, nights of passion, then suspicion, the pain of betrayal, and finally the hatred he felt for the one he once loved so passionately. These verses reveal a world of intense, private emotions that existed alongside rigid social structures. Ovid, meanwhile, offered a different perspective with his Ars Amatoria, the art of love. It was a satirical and cunning manual instructing Roman men and women on how to seduce, pursue, and maintain extramarital affairs. The work was a slap in the face to Emperor Augustus' attempts at moral reform, and it cost Ovid his life in exile. The existence of such a work and the punishment it meted out revealed a tension within Roman society. On one side, popular culture's fascination with illicit love; on the other, the government's attempt to impose a conservative moral order. While art and literature struggled to describe desire, philosophy sought to conquer it. For Stoics such as Seneca and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, desire and passion were irrational forces that threatened a man's self-control and inner peace. The goal of a Stoic was not to eliminate sex, but to practice it rationally, for example, to reproduce in marriage, without becoming enslaved by passion. They saw sex as a potential internal enemy that needed to be managed and controlled in order to achieve apatheia. Their battle was not fought on the battlefield, but in the mind. Thus, the picture of Roman culture emerges in all its complexity and contradictions. Sex was at once a spectacle in art and entertainment, a source of profound emotion in literature, and a dangerous enemy to be conquered by philosophy. The culture reveals a society both fascinated and terrified by its own desires. They were comfortable in describing their actions, but deeply confused and conflicted about the emotions and the loss of control that accompanied them. The struggle between body and spirit, between desire and reason, is one of the most enduring and complex legacies of the Roman world. From the worlds of art and philosophy, where the Romans wrestled with the very image and notion of desire, we come to the final leg of our journey: old age and legacy. What happens when the body, a theater of power, pleasure, and pain, begins to decay? Are strict rules relaxed as death approaches? The answer, once again, is paradoxical. Old age in Rome did not bring peace or freedom from social pressures. Instead, it often amplified prejudices, exposed the most brutal truths about a person's worth in society, and raised the ultimate and most important question: what legacy does a person leave behind? For a Roman man, old age was a battle against the decline of his virilitas, his masculinity. Society still expected him to maintain his virility and sexual prowess. Losing his libido meant losing a core part of his male identity. This pressure led to older, wealthy men often marrying much younger women. On the surface, this was a testament to their ageless virility. But deeper down, it was a calculated move to secure what mattered most: an heir. Having a son to carry on the family name, to pass on the wealth and status, familia, was the ultimate goal. A late marriage to a young bride was not seen as odd, but a rational act to preserve the legacy. But the line between respectability and ridiculousness was a fine one. Roman plays and satires were filled with images of old goats, sickly, impotent old men who still tried to pursue young women. This mockery showed that society was always scrutinizing and ready to tear down anyone who could not maintain a convincing performance of masculinity. The older man had to demonstrate his strength without appearing ridiculous. If old men faced ridicule, old women faced something even worse: invisibility and contempt. Once a matrona passed childbearing age, her most important social function was considered fulfilled. She gradually faded into obscurity within her own family. But the worst fate fell to the elderly widows. While a young, wealthy widow might be a bargain on the marriage market, A tool for other families to form alliances, an old widow was ruthlessly scrutinized. She was expected to live the rest of her life in purity and silence, mourning and honoring the memory of her dead husband. Any expression of sexual desire by an elderly widow was considered disgusting, unnatural, and a violation of the social order. She was ridiculed as a shameless hag, the very antithesis of social modesty. This blatant discrimination exposed the very nature of the Roman value system. A man's worth was tied to his active power, while a woman's worth was tied to her passive usefulness, primarily her ability to reproduce. When that usefulness was lost, her worth was reduced to virtually nothing. Ultimately, all these pressures and rules boil down to one goal: protecting and passing on a legacy. Sex is never a private matter. It is the engine of social mobility. A strategic marriage can elevate a family for generations. A sexual scandal, on the other hand, can destroy it. The technology of the age, from aphrodisiacs and fertility drugs to adoption, a common practice among the elite to avoid extinction, all serve this ultimate purpose. And so, after traversing every corner of Roman society, from the slave's chains to the emperor's throne, from the curse on a leaden tablet to the fiery verses of love, an undeniable truth emerges. Sex in Rome was never truly private. It was a complex and all-encompassing system of power. It was the power of master over slave, of husband over wife, of state over citizen, and the desperate struggle of each individual for power over his own body and his inheritance. Every intimate relationship was governed by inequality, exploitation, and a brutal hierarchy. These structures, these profound contradictions, did not disappear with the fall of Rome. They have left echoes that have lasted for centuries, shaping the laws, attitudes, and relationships of Western civilization in ways that we are still struggling to understand today. Our journey through the dark recesses of Roman private life comes to an end. We have gone from aristocratic bedrooms to brothel cells, from sacred rituals to vicious curses. The picture that emerges is not a monochrome world of decadence, but a complex, contradictory picture of humanity itself. The story of Rome is not just about them in the past. It is a mirror reflecting the eternal struggles that exist within each of us and in modern society. The struggle between love and power, between personal desire and social control, between the image we project and the true self we hide in the shadows. Looking at their brutality and prejudice, perhaps we should not rush to judgment, but ask ourselves, what unspoken rules govern our own relationships? Has our society truly liberated love from the calculations of status and wealth? The ruins of Pompeii and its ancient inscriptions tell more than a lost world. They are a timeless reminder. A reminder that behind every great empire, every law, every moral code, there are countless human hearts navigating the treacherous terrain of love, lust, and power. The story of Rome is a testament to the fact that when power becomes the primary language of intimate relationships, vulnerability is inevitable. And perhaps the greatest lesson they leave behind lies not in their grand structures, but in the silent echoes of lives crushed by the systems they created.